and encourage us as we fellowship together. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. All right. The sheet I gave you is the story of Jesus walking on the water, and it's all three parallel passages. And the reason I typed it out instead of turning back and forth is just to save time this morning, because the story is not completely told in any of the three Gospels, but you put them all together and you get the whole detail of that event. And so I wanted to compare that today, and in order to do that, I wanted to put it all in one sheet so we wouldn't have to be turning back and forth and back and forth, back and forth, and we lose train of thought and context. And so it's all typed out there for you, and you can compare yourself. But the unique thing I found as I was studying this week is there's a natural outline, a 4-point outline in this story that I want to share with you this morning. And it all revolves around one word. So what I did on mine, I made some marks on it. So if you look at that Matthew 22, the very first word I underlined immediately. Then you go down to verse 27, and the second word I underlined immediately again. And then you go down to verse 31, and once again I see the second word and I underlined it immediately. And then you go clear to the bottom of that page, in John 6, verse 21, and about the middle of that verse, you'll find the word immediately the fourth time. And so those are the 4 points of my outline this morning. And so what I also want to do is so that we can keep track of where we're at. In the Matthew 14 passage, if you draw a little line between verse 24 and 25, that's point 1. Then you go down to Mark, and you draw a line between 48 and 49, that's also point 1. And then you go down to John, and you draw a line between 19 and 20, that's point 1. Then point 2 is in Matthew 25 to 27. It's in Mark 49 to 50. And it's in John just verse 20. And then point 3 is 28 to 31. And that's it, just in Matthew. Matthew is the only one that contains the account of Peter. And then the final point in Matthew is verses 31 and 32. In Mark, it's 51 and 52. And in John, it's just verse 21. So with that said, that's kind of where we're going to go this morning. I want to look at this account as we study the life of Peter, because apparently this was a life-changing event, not only in the life of Peter, but most commentaries I read seem to think it was a life-changing event in the life of Matthew, because Matthew is the only one who includes this, and the things that are said in these accounts, it was definitely something that changed in the understanding of Jesus' disciples after this event. Because we see, I was reading one guy and he says, well, the reason Mark didn't include it is because maybe Peter, who is the one who helped Mark write, maybe Peter wasn't too fond of this story, so Mark didn't put it in his account. But nonetheless, it's interesting to see the detail that's given as we look through this particular event. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through each one of these points, noticing that every time it says Jesus does something immediately. And that's kind of the key that I picked up on here as we see this happening. So I'd like to start by reading Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 24. It says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And skip down to Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 48. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. Now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea and would have passed them by. And in John 6, 15 to 19, therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea towards Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 hours, or 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking. I'll stop there. Now, when you put all three passages together, you get a little bit more detail, because each one of the passages gives us just something different about the situation. And as I looked at each of these points, I saw three things under it. We see a circumstance that's happening. We see a reaction by the disciples or by Peter. And then we see a response by Christ himself. And as we go through there and we look at each of these four different immediatelys, it all follows that same outline. There's a circumstance taking place, there is a response, or there is a reaction by the disciples, and then there's a response by Christ. Now, the circumstance under this first point is we're told in the passages, the first two, that Jesus immediately sends the disciples away in the boat. Now, this story follows directly after the feeding of the 5,000. So he's just fed the 5,000, and Jesus sends his disciples immediately away, and then he says, I'm going to go back and disperse the crowd. Now, the first question I had is, why in the world was he sending them away immediately like that? And you don't get that until you read the John passage. And what does it say in John verse 15? Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. So the other two passages tell us that Jesus went to the mountain to pray, but they don't tell us the reason Christ did that. And apparently the reason he sent his disciples away, because I don't think he wanted them to get caught up on this fervor of making him king. And that was the problem. That wasn't Jesus' purpose for coming, and it definitely wasn't his time for coming. So he immediately puts his disciples in a boat, and he sends them across the sea towards Capernaum, Bethsaida area, and then he goes up to pray alone on top of this mountain, or this hill that overlooks the Sea of Galilee. And so the situation is such, the disciples have gotten into the boat, and they're going across, and the detail of the event here, the circumstance that's taking place, is we find that they are in the middle of the sea. It says they have rowed for 3 or 4 hours, or miles. I keep saying hours. I don't know why I keep saying that. 3 or 4 miles, which means they're about halfway across the Sea of Galilee. It's about 7 miles across the sea. And so they're in the middle, and then it says the wind comes up. A couple different phrases. If you noticed in here, it says that they were in the middle of the sea. They were tossed by the sea. The waves were there. The wind was contrary. In other words, it meant that the wind was blowing right at them. So they're going this way and the wind's going that way, so they're stuck. And there's large waves, and they're stuck out there in the middle of this windstorm on the middle of the lake. What is their reaction? Well, interesting. Mark 48 says, then he saw them straining at rowing. In John, it says that they rowed for 3 or 4 miles. They were out there working and straining and rowing and getting nowhere. You know, their reaction to the windstorm, of course, is to work harder and to try harder. And it didn't seem like they were getting anywhere. They were just stuck in the situation. The circumstance is that, you know, it was beyond their control. They couldn't do anything about it. You know, the neat thing about the story, though, is when you compare the three, is you see Jesus' response to them being stuck in this circumstance that they could not control. In Mark chapter 6, verse 48, it says, remember where Jesus sees them. The whole time he's watching. He's had an eye on them the whole time. He knows. And when it gets to the point where they can no longer proceed, he knows it's time. It says to them. He goes to help. You know, it's really so many circumstances in our lives that are beyond our control. And it can be frustrating, and we can, work and try to figure it out and use our logic and whatever the case might be. But it's, you know what? The lesson that the disciples are going to learn is that the whole time they're struggling, Christ is overseeing things. He has his eye on them. He's watching them. And when the time was right, he came. He came to them. He went to them. And so he immediately sent them out into the sea, but the whole time he was overseeing them. He had his eye on them. And when it was time, he went. The situation continues. The next immediately, it tells us in verse 27, it says, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, is where that one is. But what's the situation in this second point? First of all, verse 25 says, now it is the fourth watch of the night. That means it's between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So I think that what I like to do is picture this mental image of what the event is about. So it's between 3 and 6, so it's dark, depending on if it's closer to 6 or closer to 3. There's sunlight, not a lot. There's a storm going on. There's waves, it tells us. The boat is tossed, and they are in the middle of this storm, and what else is going on? The rest of the circumstance is such that it tells us that Jesus walks to them on the water, on top of the water, and let's see, I think it's John that says, let me find it. Well, I'll just read it. Verse 19 of John says, so when they had rowed 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the water and drawing near the boat. So try to picture this. They're in the middle of the storm. It's dark, maybe a little bit of light. Makes you wonder how Jesus saw them on top of the mountain. Of course, he's Jesus. He could see through the dark, I guess. But they couldn't see much. Only thing they could see is there's these waves and this wind, and it's dark, and they're tired. They've been up all night, because it tells us right there at the beginning it was dark when they left, and now it's really dark. They've rowed all night long. And then they see this figure of a man coming. What's it say? In verse 19 there, John, it says, drawing near the boat. There's this ghost or whatever floating across the water, and it's getting closer. You imagine they're probably rowing harder and faster, right? Because there's this guy floating across the water towards them, but they don't know who it is yet. And so what's their reaction? Well, it says they're afraid. They're afraid. Look at the reaction there. It says in Matthew chapter 14, now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the water. And when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were troubled, saying, it is a ghost. And they cried out for fear. And Mark says, verse 49, and when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. And down in John it says, in verse 19, so when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. So their reaction to the circumstances, this unknown situation, they're afraid. They're afraid because they don't know what this is. They've never seen anybody walk across the water in the middle of the night in a storm. But I like what it says they use. The words that are used there is 2 words. It says, one says they were troubled, and the other says they supposed it was a ghost. Now I was thinking about that. And all worry summed up in those 2 words. You think about it. When we worry about something, it's always because we suppose something might happen, right? It's like, maybe this is what's going to happen, and I'm concerned about that, and it makes me anxious because I don't know what's going to happen. I don't recognize the situation. I don't have any control over it. And they supposed it was a ghost. Now, their theology in that thought was, I'm sure there was something. Maybe they thought it was the death angel come to drown them or something. I don't know. But they were afraid, and it says they cried out in fear. They screamed. Somebody was screaming. I told this story to the VBS kids, and I said, it's probably Judas, right? He screamed. I don't know. Somebody screamed. It says they cried out in fear. They were hollering, it's coming closer, right? But you got to picture the scene there. It's just, I mean, what would we do in a situation like that? It's dark, you can't see. You see something, but you don't know what it is. But what does Jesus immediately do? He talks to them. He talks to them. That's what it says. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them in Matthew. In Mark, it says, and he talked with them. But immediately, he talked with them. Jesus said something to them, it says there in John. What does he say? 3 things. Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid. The first thing I saw when I was looking through this passage was that if you take a Greek literal translation, the phrase that says, it is I, literally is, be of good cheer. I am. Don't be afraid. That puts a whole different perspective on what he's saying when he says it that way. I am. Don't be afraid. Be of good cheer has the idea, have courage. Have courage. Don't be afraid. You know, their suppositions that it was a ghost were unsubstantiated. They were unfounded. It was just what they supposed it was because they didn't know what it was. And they were worrying without a cause, without a reason. Their worry was there. And you know, as I think about it, the things I've worried about over the years, most of the time, that would be the same thing they could be classified as. Unsubstantiated fears. Didn't need to worry about them. All I needed to listen to Christ. All I needed to do was just look at his word and let him talk to me. And yet, we worry with unsubstantiated suppositions. And that's exactly what they did. They worried about something. They were afraid about something that they didn't need to be afraid about because it wasn't even true. It wasn't a ghost. It was Christ himself coming to help them. Now, the third thing we see here, and this third point here, this is the story of Peter in this situation. Now, you know, I've thought about this a lot, and you know, Peter usually gets a bum rap in this story because he took his eyes off Christ and he sank. But he got out of the boat. You realize that he got out of the boat in a storm, and he walked on water for a ways. I mean, you could read it that he walked all the way out to where Christ was. He went to Jesus, it said. Or he made it part way. But either way, he got out of the boat. That's the key thing. I mean, Peter had some degree of faith. And, you know, we're told in other passages, as we have faith, the grain of a mustard seed, we can say to that mountain, move over to here and go into the sea, and it'll happen. I mean, a little faith is powerful. Peter had some faith. Either that or he had stubborn idiocy. I don't know what. But nonetheless, he got out of the boat. We can't disregard that issue. He got out of the boat and he walked on water, just like Christ did. So what is the situation? They're all afraid. You know, I can't imagine. You know, only, 5 of those guys were fishermen. The rest were not. So, I mean, they had to have been sick by this point, because you can't be tossed around in a boat without getting sick. I mean, I can't even go on a roller coaster anymore without being sick. I mean, it's impossible. It's too much motion. These guys are messed up. But Peter What's his response? Matthew, verse 28. When Jesus says, don't be afraid, Peter says, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Now, most windstorms I've been in, you have to shout over the wind, right? So this whole conversation is being hollered out across the water. Peter didn't say this quietly, nor did Christ say it quietly. Peter says, if it's you, command me to come out there and walk on the water just like you are. I don't know what he was thinking. You know, this whole scenario, if you think about it, the whole situation here, the circumstances, what's about to happen, is because of Peter's choice. You know, we make choices sometimes, and you know, we think them through, we rationalize things, we plan, and then we make a choice. Most of us do. I know I work with a lot of customers that can't make a choice for nothing. Drives me nuts. But most people can make choices, and sometimes those choices are good, and sometimes they're not. I had an employee one time that he's one of those guys that he was afraid to do anything wrong, and so he wouldn't do anything. Just wouldn't do nothing. The whole day would go by and he'd hardly have anything accomplished. And I told him one time, I said, hey, it doesn't matter. Just do something. If it's wrong, we'll redo it. But at least you got something done. But Peter made a choice. This whole scenario and the fact that he's about to drown is because he chose to get out of the boat. And you know, there's lots of times in our lives when we make choices that later we say, man, I wish I hadn't made that choice. That was a poor choice. It really is. But you know what? Peter hollers out and he says, Lord, if it's really you, because they still couldn't see for sure who it was. All they could see is this ghosty person out there walking on top of the water. Command me to come to you. I don't know what that command business was. Maybe he was saying, you know, well, then make it possible for me to walk on water. What was Jesus' response? I like it. Come. He just says, come. That's the only word that says there, verse 29. And he said, come. And when Peter had come down out of the boat, and notice what it says, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. So Peter got out of the boat and he walked on water. And he's walking out there to Jesus. And can you imagine what the other disciples are saying? Whoa, look at Peter, he's walking on the water. Probably the ones that weren't sick, hanging over the side. But this, I believe, was and we're going to see later as we finish up this here, this was a life-changing event in the life of these disciples. After this event, the disciples' view of Christ completely changed. This was something where Christ taught them something, and he's about to teach Peter something in this scenario. Even though it was Peter's choice to get out of the boat, it was Peter's choice to walk across the water. And then because of Peter's choice, he sank because of his lack of faith. So we find the situation is such. Peter's made this choice. He stepped out of the boat. He's walking on the water. And what happens? Verse 30. And when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. Well, there's a lot of being afraid in this passage, if you notice that. He was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. You know, we can look at this story and we can see, well, Peter took his eyes off Christ, he looked at the wind, and then he failed. And yes, that's true. When we take our eyes off Christ, when we take our support and our courage from Christ and put it on ourselves, we will fail. And that's exactly what happened to Peter. You know, Peter, thought he was probably, okay, I can do this. But then he looked at the waves, and he was afraid. Now, I don't know how they walked on this water. If there was waves, it goes up and it goes down and it goes up and it goes down, and it's like, they were walking up and down like this too. I don't know, maybe. But he looked at the waves, and maybe one smacked him in the face, and he got wet, and then he was distracted, and he turned away, and he says he began to sink. But what does he do? His response is that his reaction is that he says, Lord, save me. That was the right response. There's some right things about Peter's actions and his choice here. He got out of the boat, he walked on water, and when he got in trouble, he cried out to the right source, to Christ to help him. And what is Christ's immediate response? Verse 31. Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand, and he caught him. I like that. Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand, and he caught him. We're going to find that he led him right back to the boat. It must mean they both walked on the water on the way back, but Peter was being held up on the way back. Christ came and rescued Peter immediately. Peter now is about to get a lesson by Christ. Christ uses this opportunity. Probably, I envision it happening on the way back to the boat. And Christ says something to Peter there in that verse 31. It says, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Literally that phrase, that word there is only used twice in the entire New Testament. "O you of little faith." It literally means, it's actually like a nickname. It's like, white feather or whatever. It's little faith. He says, "Oh, you little faith." He's actually calling Peter little faith. He says, "Little faith, why did you doubt?" The word doubt there has the idea of being at a crossroads between two choices and trying to do both. It's not possible. And really, if you think about it, that's what doubt is. So I go this way, should I do this? I'm doubting. But Christ is saying, little faith, you're trying to do both. Trust me, or you have this other idea about who I am. And he's giving Peter this lesson at this point. He says, your mind is divided about who I am. And because of that, you sank. Because your mind is divided. You have doubt about who I am. It's Peter who later on was the first to acknowledge that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Maybe it's this incident that brought him to that point. But at this point, Christ is saying, little faith? Now, he had some faith. We know that. He got out of the boat, he walked. But he had doubt. His faith wasn't totally on Christ. Faith is a question, you struggle with all your life, I think. What is faith? Do I have enough faith? Did I have faith in the right thing? Faith is such a arbitrary concept, if you would, that it's hard to put into words and to define. Other than that, it is just complete. Our mind is completely accepting this truth. I believe it to be true with all my heart, with no two-sided double choice. I have no doubt. In other words, I have put my trust in something. It's like stepping out of that boat. You step out, will your foot go in the water or will it stay on top of the water? All of us have to come to a grips about faith when it comes to God. It's only through faith that we are saved. It's only through faith we can walk with Christ. Faith is the key. And Peter here says, had little faith. He had some, but he had doubt at this point. His doubt was such that he was trying to do He had two mindsets about Jesus Christ. He had not yet decided. He had not made that ultimate commitment to Christ, that he was the only response and only action. Fourthly here, there's some interesting points in this end. Down in John, in fact, I want to read all four of these. Well, three of these. We'll start with verse 32 of Matthew. And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Mark 51. Then he went up to the boat to them, and the wind ceased. And they were greatly amazed in themselves, beyond measure, and marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. And then John 20, verse 21. Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. Now, there's some interesting things that are going on here that maybe you've missed before in the story. First of all, it says they get back to the boat, and the first thing that happens is the wind stops. The storm's done. It just stops. Well, that's an amazing thing, apparently, because it says as soon as that happened, they all worshiped him. It tells us there in Mark, they were all amazed beyond measure and marveled because the wind quit. Well, and probably because he walked on water. You see, they received him into the boat. They let him in the boat, and immediately their circumstance changed when they let him into the boat. Now, Mark 6, verse 52. I want you to think about the meaning of this verse. So they get into the boat. All the disciples are amazed. They marvel. This is just beyond it. They can't hardly believe what's happened. But verse 52 says, "For they had not understood about the loaves." What in the world does that mean? They didn't understand about the loaves. They just fed the kids lunch, the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. And he says the whole problem with these disciples being afraid and being marveled at what happened is because they didn't understand about the loaves. What in the world does that mean? Right? What didn't they understand about that?
The way he multiplied what they had.
Okay. What was that supposed to show them?
That he was Jesus, the Messiah.
That he was God, right? Because look at what's happened. There's 4 things that have happened to them in just less than 24 hours. The loaves. Jesus walked on water. He calmed the storm immediately. And there's one more thing that you find down there in John. And when they willingly received him into the boat, what happened immediately? The boat was teleported, right? It went 3 miles immediately. There's 4 things that happened that they should have recognized, and apparently they did at this point. That's why I keep saying I believe this event was the event that changed their view of who Jesus was. They got it right. That's why Mark writes, "For they had not understood about the loaves." But now he adds this other statement, "because their heart was hardened." Now, this wasn't a heart of sin of any kind. It was just that they already had a mindset of what they thought the Messiah was to be and do. But it was wrong. They had the wrong idea, the wrong understanding, if you would. They lacked understanding until Jesus demonstrated these 4 things to them that he changed. Apparently, they were supposed to have learned something about who he was by the multiplying of the loaves. They missed that lesson. They just thought it was a cool trick, apparently. But when he walks on water, when he stops the storm, and when he teleports their boat, whoa, then it says they were greatly amazed, beyond measure, and marveled. This was life-changing to them. And it tells us there in Matthew, when those who were in the boat came and worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." I believe that this is the event in the life of these disciples, and Peter especially, I think, as we were studying him, where it changed for them. They finally got it. This catastrophic thing, and I think that's why Matthew includes the part about Peter. But I like the fact that they, all of these things just accumulated at once. You know, the lesson is simple. It really is a simple lesson here. I mean, you could draw out the fact that, you know, we need Christ for the circumstances we are in. We need Christ when we worry. We need Christ when, you know, we make poor choices, when we lack understanding. You could draw those applications out of here. But you know, there's a real simple application too, besides those. If you need help with your life, let Christ in the boat. Because when the disciples let Christ in the boat, some things drastically changed. The storm stopped, and they were immediately through the circumstances. It was all done. Immediately it was in the circumstances were finished. You know, it's the same with salvation. Until we let Christ into our lives, then we're still stuck in the mess of life and the sin that we have. We're still stuck there. But through faith, we allow him into our boat, into our heart, and the circumstances change. The end result is now settled. Eternity with Christ. But until we do, it's like these disciples. They're in this storm, they're struggling, they're trying to do it on their own. They're fearful, they're worrying about things that their minds have concocted. All of these things are troubling them. But when they let Christ into their boat, then it was done. The questions were settled, it was answered, they had hope, and they were safe on land. And I think as I was looking through this week, you know, I think there's a lot of lessons you could draw out of this passage. But the key thing is that the disciples have now come to the realization that this prophet, who they thought it was, is truly now the Son of God. He's divine, God himself, come to do the task that he's set for. Let's close in prayer.